So this is why I think it's really fascinating, having spent a lot of time with Christian theologians in the past couple of years writing this book, is that the original conceit, I think, when you talk with people who are Christian and Jewish and you have sort of interfaith conversations, the original one-sentence conceit and the difference between them is that what you hear from Jews is Judaism is acts-based and Christianity is faith-based. Christianity is about the acceptance of Christ. When you accept Christ, then you've accepted what you need to accept, and everything flows therefrom. And Judaism says it's not just about accepting God, it's all these mitzvot, right? There are all these commandments that you have to do, and these are what perfect you as a human being. It's the performance of these commandments, accepting God's sovereignty because he's the one who gave the commandments, but you actually have to act in the world, and if you don't act in the world, then you haven't fulfilled your responsibility in the world.
This could also be an argument why you could have, although I know you wouldn't be thrilled with them per se, you could have Jewish atheists in that they believe that it's just their actions here.
Yes, 100%. So this is why Jews have had and I think most Christians believe this too. The idea of having a moral atheist is not really a difficult idea. It's the idea of having a system built on atheism that's completely immoral and will fall apart almost immediately, and the idea of having a moral system built on atheism, if you examine your atheism closely enough, I think falls apart. I think that moral atheism is basically you separating your morality from your atheism and then ignoring your atheism in pursuit of the morality, which is, well, you can live fine that way, that's fine, but I don't think that that's psychologically sustainable if you actually examine the core of your ideas. But with that said, I think that Christianity, after its original millenarian viewpoint, when Christianity first came about, the idea of Christ on earth was that he had ushered in the Messianic era, because it was a new era, it was a new day, and then it turns out that people looked around and went, well, this looks a lot like the old day, right? Not that much has changed. And so what changed? What changed was our spiritual status. That was the new redefinition of the Messianic era, is that what Christ had brought to earth was a new spirit, right? He brought a new spirit into the earth, and he'd cleansed people of their sins and given them a fresh shot at life, basically. And that in doing so, he'd changed the nature of how things work. Well, Judaism basically said, well, we never thought that nature changed in the first place, right? That's something different. And so, ironically enough, I think one of the sources of Christian anti-Semitism over time is an attempt to distinguish what makes Christianity different from Judaism other than Christ. Because Christianity and Judaism, in most of their main philosophies, have an awful lot in common. It's interesting. I just interviewed a fellow named John MacArthur, who's a major pastor, major Christian theologian. I interviewed him a couple of days ago for our Sunday special. And this came up. I asked him, so where do you think the differences are between Christianity and Judaism? And he basically said, Jesus. Right? That's the difference. And I think that is the mostly honest answer, because when I hear Christian theologians try to distinguish Judaism from Christianity, what they say about Judaism I find to be not accurate as to what Judaism actually says. And when I hear Jews try to distinguish Christianity from Judaism, I think that, and I'm not saying they're the same thing, because they're not, obviously, they're different belief systems, but in terms of the underlying value system, the reason that we say Judeo-Christian value system is because in terms of the value system itself, the commonalities are overwhelming. They're overwhelming. The differences are mostly doctrinal and historical, and in terms of what you think God, I think that Christians read back in an acts-based version of their own lives through a variety of mechanisms, whether they say, well, predestination exists, but in order to show that if I were really elect, I would be acting this way, right? That is an acts-based version. It's just retroactive from the end. And so this is why if you say to a Christian, so you really believe that you can lead a terribly dissolute, awful, terrible life, but if you believe in Christ with the full fiber of your being, you're going to heaven? And they'll say, and many of them will say, yes, but then you say, but what makes a good person? And they'll say, right, not, but if, and what they'll always add, but if you believe in Christ, you wouldn't do all those things.
Well, that's the thing. Well, and that's why people are always criticizing me when I give an answer to the question that you just asked, because my answer has been, well, I act as if God exists. So, well, that's kind of weaselly. It's like, no, it's not, because it gets to the core of this. What do you mean by believe? Well, do you believe in Christ? Well, does that mean you utter the words that he existed? Well, that's a pretty shallow form of belief. In fact, I think that's no form of belief at all. In fact, it says in the New Testament, Christ himself says is something along the lines of, not all those who utter the words, Lord, Lord, will be saved. Right, and Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity, doctrinal Christianity, was basically based on the idea that Christianity had taken the easy route out by insisting upon the statement of faith rather than the embodiment of the belief in action, which would be the imitation of Christ.
Which, by the way, is Jesus' original criticism of Judaism, right? Is that everybody takes the commandments extraordinarily seriously, but they don't take the spirit of the commandments seriously.
Yes, exactly. That's right. That's exactly right. It is the same. It's the same thing. And so, you know, Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity was that there were very few real Christians because they didn't take on the burden of the action. And I would say the belief is actually manifested in the burden of the action. Now, you might want to be in a position, if you were a Christian, to say, well, my explicit statements of belief match what I act out, because maybe there'd be a unity in that. But the fundamental issue is what the belief is manifested in what you do, because that's what you stake. For me, belief is what you stake your life on. That's belief. Right. And you stake your life on what you act out. And so you're trying to act out the idea that, well, I think that you take on the suffering of the world and the malevolence of the world as your responsibility.
You know, what's really fascinating is I think that what this comes down to, a lot of this debate comes down to from which end you're teaching. I think that it's almost two sides of one coin. And if you're talking to a bunch of people who are not religious, who don't believe in the Bible, right? You're talking to an adult who looks at the Bible and says, I don't believe all of these ridiculous miracles happen. Why should I bother engaging? Why should I believe all this stuff? And my argument has always been, because you do believe all this stuff, you're just pretending that you don't, in the sense that you don't care about the historical circumstance, but all the things that you're acting out in daily life. I said this to Sam, right, on stage, is that, you know, you and I hold 95% the same values. Where do you think those came from? And Sam said, well, you know, I've done a lot of studying and a lot of reading. I said, but that doesn't explain why you and I hold 95% of the same values, because I haven't done any of those things, right? I didn't spend any time studying the philosophies of the East. The reason we hold 95% the same values is because you grew up in a Judeo-Christian civilization with 3,000 years of common history. That's why we share the same value system.
You didn't eat mushrooms on a river in Brazil?
Exactly. And somehow we end up in pretty much the same place about what we think is actually important in life and which liberties are important and all this stuff. And we have disagreements around the edges. But this is the West, right? The West is different. It is not the same as other philosophies. And so when I'm talking to people about that, the case that I'm making is you are part of this great river of history. You can pretend you're not part of that great river. You can pretend you're not living off the fumes of that river. You are living. You can pretend that the gas tank is running on its own. It ain't. Okay. There's a deposit of fuel, and you are still living off that. But that is a different thing than what you teach a child. And this is where I think that things become different, because I think that your philosophy, Jordan, is self-sustaining to a group of people who are looking at the values they live and saying, where did these come from and how do I justify these values? But I think that it would be very difficult to teach a child values before you teach the myth. So I think that you're coming at people and saying to them, your values can be justified by the myth.
Yeah.
But when you're teaching a child values,
it's a myth.
You have to teach it. You have to teach the kids the story first,
of course,
and then come the values.
Yes.
And so there's a difference between. And this is
they
why,
won't even listen unless you teach the story first.
Exactly. And this is why, as a religious person, I teach my kids the stories first, because the values are embedded in the stories. And do I have questions about the stories? What rational person wouldn't have questions about the stories? Of course you have questions about the reality or the historicity of the stories. That doesn't undercut, number one, the importance of the stories. And number two, the point is that you have to believe the fundamental assumptions embedded in the stories, in order for the values to
and that's exactly why you said before that the Enlightenment couldn't have just sprung out of nothing, right? I mean, that's exactly what you were saying, that it needed all of the bedrock.
Well, and I would think that for people who are fundamental evolutionary biologists, and I kept trying to make this case to, well, you can make a case like that to Pinker and the psychologist, but also to Harris. It's like, where do you guys get off thinking that this is a consequence of the last 300, 400 years?
Right.
It's like, we're looking at time spans. Even the Enlightenment figures, they lived in a world that was like 6,000 years old. We're living in a world that's 3.5 billion years old. You have to extend your thinking about the origins of phenomena like morality way back past the Enlightenment.